If there's any place that's almost guaranteed to have ghost stories, it's a medieval castle. And Warwick Castle in Warwickshire is most definitely no different. It's been standing proudly next to the River Avon for centuries, and during that time has been the backdrop for some of the most important moments in English history. But where you've got events that change the country's landscape forever, you've usually got death, deceit, and high treason, of which Warwick Castle has seen all of it. So it comes as no surprise that even now the torture has been laid off and the oubliette has been emptied, there appears to be ghostly echoes remaining from the castle's turbulent past, with witnesses claiming to encounter everything from unexplained noises through to apparitions that wander the corridors. But with talk of hellhounds and phantom murder victims being passed down through time, it does leave you wondering how much of Warwick Castle's ghostly reputation is built on fact, or are the ghost stories more of a lesson in how much you should trust the living? If you're in the area of Warwick nowadays, especially during the school holidays, you're going to be greeted with droves of tourists dragging the kids along for a fun family day out at one of the UK's top visitor attractions. And if you've ever been, you'll already know, but it really is a fantastic day out. But it obviously hasn't always been waxworks and jousting competitions, and the history in this castle goes back a long time, and it gets messy. So a fortification has stood on this site since 914, built by Ethelfleda, the daughter of King Alfred the Great, because they needed these military strongholds to protect the Kingdom of Mercia from the invading Vikings. Fast forward to 1066 though, William the Conqueror was over here, doing what he did best, winning the Battle of Hastings and taking over England. And as he's moving through the country, he needs to solidify his power and make sure he's not coming back to rebellions and things. He spots the Anglo-Saxon fortress that's sitting here and decides he's going to need this one before he heads up north to keep on conquering. So by 1068, he'd had the fortress changed into a motte and bailey stronghold. So the motte, that was the mound upon which the fortified keep was built, and then the bailey was an area next to the motte, again still fortified, but where the day-to-day things would take place, where the stables were, where castle staff, servants, soldiers and such lived. To make sure everything stayed under Norman control, King William appointed Henry de Beaumont as Constable of Warwick Castle, and he did such a good job that in 1088 Henry was made the first Earl of Warwick. But the castle wouldn't stay safely in the Beaumont family for very long. In 1153, Henry of Anjou was working his way through the country, battling against the current King Stephen for the English throne in the civil war known as the Anarchy. It was a super messy family feud that also involved Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, because she was the daughter of King Henry I. So her son Henry knew that taking Warwick Castle was going to be super helpful to his and his mother's cause, but the way he got Warwick Castle to surrender to him, super shady. At that time, Henry de Beaumont's son, Roger de Beaumont, the second Earl of Warwick, was living in the castle with his wife Gundrada de Warenne. Roger was away fighting on King Stephen's side, and Henry basically approached the castle and told the Countess of Warwick, "Look, I'm really sorry, your husband has died on the battlefield. Yeah, super tragic, I know. So sorry for your loss and all of that, but basically you've got no choice, you need to hand the castle over to me." And so Gundrada, thinking that she was now a widow and really did have no choice, did as she was told. But when Roger came back, very much alive, and found out what had happened, he was so heartbroken that he's said to have literally died from the shame. The year after, in 1154, Henry of Anjou was crowned King Henry II, after Stephen had fallen ill and named Henry as his successor. During his reign, Warwick Castle underwent some alterations, but he'd actually given the castle back to the Beaumont family not too long after he'd taken it. The reason was that the Beaumonts had actually, for a time, been supporters of Empress Matilda and her claim to the throne. They'd just done a smidge of side switching, a little bit of fighting for King Stephen, nothing major, messy medieval politics and all of that. And going off on a tangent, if you were wondering why Henry ended up on the throne instead of his mum, who was the daughter of King Henry I, and so she had the claim to the throne, it was basically down to more messy politics and the fact that having a king in charge was more palatable than a queen. So yeah. In the 13th century, the castle passed to the Beauchamp family through marriage, and they kicked off a bunch of changes. The motte and bailey design was replaced with a stone keep, they increased the defences. Thomas de Beauchamp, the 11th Earl of Warwick, in the 1300s built a big old gatehouse, a barbican, which is the fortified bit in front of the gatehouse, and then those iconic towers that we can still see today. Richard Neville, known as the Kingmaker, he inherited the castle and became the 16th Earl of Warwick when his wife Anne de Beauchamp died in 1449. And this guy, he's worth a mention because he was powerful. He earned his Kingmaker nickname during the Wars of the Roses when he put Edward IV death on the throne in 1461. But because if we've learned one thing today, it's that nothing in medieval politics is simple, and Richard actually fell out with Edward when the king went off and married a woman called Elizabeth Woodville, which was not in Neville's plan. He had wanted to create a nice little alliance with France through a royal marriage. And so in 1469, Richard Neville actually imprisoned the king in Warwick Castle, although it didn't go down super well with the English nobility, and a few months later he had to release him. Unsurprisingly, Richard and King Edward still weren't seeing eye to eye after that, and Richard even helped to restore King Henry VI back on the throne in 1470, the very same king that he'd helped Edward take the throne from. I know, it's just utterly wild. Richard Neville was killed in battle in 1471 at the Battle of Barnet though, bringing to a bloody end his days of playing Game of Thrones for realsies. After his death, Warwick Castle went back to royal control and was passed through more noble families before being granted to a guy called Sir Fulk Greville in 1604 by King James I. And we're getting to the point where you can start to think about moving away from that need for a heavily fortified military stronghold now. You can start to show off your wealth by living in a stately palace rather than a fort. And so Sir Fulk Greville did just that, investing thousands of pounds, which would equate to millions in today's money, into turning Warwick Castle into a palace fit for a noble family. And we're going to come back to Fulk later because he's got his very own dark story. But it wasn't all stately homes and garden parties just yet though. The castle still had an important role to play in the English Civil War, where it was under parliamentary control. And so it's likely that prisoners from the Battle of Edge Hill, one of the most important battles of the war, which was fought about 20 miles away, may have been kept in the dungeons at Warwick Castle. But as we move further on in time, the castle started to see some stability. After being involved in so many different power grabs, conflicts and dramas over the centuries, it was still under the control of the Greville family and had been starting to welcome in visitors who wanted to take a look around. Interest in having a nosy around the castle only grew in the 18th into the 19th century. In 1858, Queen Victoria visited. Everything seemed to be going well. Although in 1871, the castle suffered from a devastating fire which absolutely gutted the Great Hall and damaged other areas like the private apartments. Just to give you an idea of this fire, the steward's servant Joe Powell was the first to figure out something was wrong when he could hear what sounded like hail on the roof. Yeah, it wasn't hail. It was the lead roof melting and dripping onto the roof below. They were able to repair the castle though, and visitors could again come and enjoy the castle. Until 1885, when the 4th Earl of Warwick, George Greville, decided, you know what, enough tourists, shut the gates to the public, who were not happy with this turn of events. But thankfully, in 1900, the castle reopened under the ownership of George's son, the 5th Earl of Warwick, Francis Richard Greville, after his dad had died in 1893. And they were right at the start of leaning into the whole tourism thing. They opened with a ticket office and had one guide working there permanently. And as the 20th century wore on, the Earls of Warwick continued to nurture and grow this new income stream for the castle. But by 1978, after 374 years in the Greville family, the castle was sold to none other than the Two Swords Group. Yep, as in Madame Two Swords Waxworks. They took on the castle, invested a bunch of money into it, and turned it into a full-on tourist attraction. Later on, through various mergers and things, the castle came to be owned by the Merlin Entertainments Group, who also own things like Alton Towers, Legoland, big old theme parks like that. And so that brings us all the way up to the present day, from strategic fortified military stronghold to a fun day out for all the family. And besides from the live action shows, the trebuchet talks, the falconers, the costumed guides and everything else, the paranormal is never too far away from the limelight at Warwick Castle. And I mean, how can it be when one of the towers, the Watergate Tower, is lovingly known as the Ghost Tower? And it's known that because of one particular castle resident who I introduced you to a little bit earlier, Sir Fulk Greville. He was the one who poured what would nowadays be millions of pounds into the castle. It hadn't been lived in for 14 years before him. It was kind of in an awful state. Once he was done with it, he referred to the castle as the most princely seat within the Midlands. I guess there's no need to be humble when you're proud of what you built, I guess. But outside of Warwick Castle, Fulk was a very important man. He was a poet and a playwright, and a pretty talented one at that too. But he was also good with the numbers. So good, in fact, that he was actually Treasurer of the Navy, and then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then Commissioner of the Treasury. Very important financial roles in the country. In 1628 though, he was in his 70s by this point. It's time to start thinking a little bit further ahead. And being the numbers man that he was, he thought it best to write his will. So in February of that year, Greville had written out his will, and as part of making it all official, he had had two of his servants who he knew could read and write to witness it. Fulk had never married and he didn't have kids, so he was going to leave everything to his cousin Robert Greville. One of the servants who had been called to witness Fulk sorting out his will was a guy called Ralph Hayward. And apparently Ralph had been with Greville for a long time, but on reading through the will, he was not super happy to learn that Fulk wasn't going to be leaving him a single thing, even though he'd left small provisions for other people. Ralph was heated about this, and he stewed on it for months. In September 1628, 1628, Fulk was lying in bed in his house in Holborn, London, when Ralph just snapped for whatever reason. He was screaming at Fulk about how it wasn't fair, he'd been a loyal servant for years. What the heck, man? Where's my inheritance? Fulk spat back saying like, excuse me, remember your position, my guy, you're my employee, I don't owe you a single thing. Obviously that was not the answer that Ralph was looking for, and so he stabbed his boss and ran out of the room. Realising the enormity of what he had just done, Ralph actually turned the blade on himself and was found dead not too long after that. Fulk was not that lucky though. It took him an entire month to die of his injuries because his doctors had packed the stab wounds with animal fat, which had then turned rancid and caused a massive infection, which meant he'd died in agony on the 30th of September 1628. Very interestingly though, not before making a quick amendment to his will to leave a little bit of money for the surgeons who had tried to help him after the attack. Just a final post-mortem smack in the face to Ralph, I guess. He was brought back to Warwick Castle before being laid to rest in St Mary's Church in Warwick. But now it seems like his ghost is said to still roam the halls, especially his old study in the Watergate Tower. People had claimed to see his sad shadow looking at them from dark corners, his screams of pain have been heard, and he's even been witnessed climbing out of his portrait. But here's where things get a little interesting. We obviously know that Fulk was a real person, and he lived at Warwick Castle, and he was murdered at his other house in London, not the castle itself. Okay, fine, you can imagine it that maybe he came back to the castle and his spirit is still in pain and that's the screaming you can hear, maybe? But where it gets really interesting is that this story of the ghost of Sir Fulk Greville seems to be a new story. In 1926, the Nottingham Evening Post ran a story about the haunted castle where they interviewed Charles Greville, the 7th Earl of Warwick, and his family. And the ghost of Sir Fulk and his screams of pain in the Watergate Tower didn't even get a mention. And it's not like Charles was one of these that would shy away from the ghosts either. It seems like he was big into the income that the paranormal tourism could bring to the castle, because Charles had actually been trying to make it big over in Hollywood, mingling with all the A-listers, running down his bank accounts, and so was in some financial trouble anyway. If people wanted to pay to come to the castle because of some ghost, yeah, sure, we've got ghosts, we've got loads of them, just not Fulk. Then a bit later on in the 20th century, the Watergate Tower had started to be referred to as this ghost tower. And then in 2004, the Two Swords group had turned Fulk's story into one of those actor-based attractions. They'd just taken his story and ran with it, cementing it into the fabric of the castle. Whereas the origins of that story look a little shady and, dare I say, financially motivated. That's not to say that there isn't something going on in the ghost tower though. There are still plenty of people still experiencing weird things in there. A mist has been seen materializing in his study, disembodied moans and screams have apparently been heard. People have felt someone walking behind them, but when they turn around, there's no one there. Others have been grabbed, and one newspaper reporter who was investigating the tower emerged in the morning with a hand-shaped bruise on his arm, which is a hard no from me if that was a ghost, but also I can fully empathise if you were so scared that you were holding yourself tightly enough to bruise yourself, you know? And the reason to me that it's so significant that there's no mention of Fulk Greville's ghost anywhere earlier than the 20th century is because there were, in particular, two Countesses of Warwick, who were very much into the paranormal in the 1800s into the 1900s. And they also don't mention Fulk Greville at all. Anne Greville, the 4th Countess of Warwick, she believed that the castle was haunted and was so disturbed by mysterious noises at night that she moved bedrooms multiple times just to try and get away from it. I mean, can you just imagine? You're in a literal castle and still can't get a good night's sleep because some ghost won't stop making noises. But Anne didn't stop there, as she was living in the castle during the 19th century, just as spiritualism was booming. And so she started holding seances with spiritual mediums and occultists in the Kenilworth bedroom. And apparently they saw the figure of a little girl holding a bunch of flowers. But it gets even more interesting. In 2018, some handwritten transcripts of these seances were found. Full-on rushed notes where it looks like they'd tried automatic writing, which if you don't know, automatic writing is when someone sits down and lets the spirit world channel words onto paper without you even looking at what you're writing. And these transcripts that came to light seem to revolve around communication with the ghost of an old servant called Edward Jameson. Apparently, this was the ghost that had been disturbing Anne's sleep. According to the seance notes, Edward had stolen something from the household in the past and was now making noise, maybe trying to look for the thing that he took, but that he was being helped by two other spirits. The family apparently looked for whatever this thing could be, but they never found anything, and we don't know any more than that. But then we've got Daisy Greville, the 5th Countess of Warwick and the daughter-in-law of Anne. Daisy, bless her, she had a bit of a reputation, and she was known as this socialite who would throw the most Great Gatsby parties, but that these parties would usually end in seances involving the remaining guests who hadn't partied too hard on Chateau Margaux wine and passed out on the chaise longue. Because Daisy was super into that world, she even invited the Aleister Crowley to come and take part in these seances, Aleister Crowley being the infamous occultist known as the wickedest man alive. And some say that it was during one of these seances where a portal was opened in the Kenilworth bedroom, which was never closed. Even Daisy's husband, Francis Greville, the 5th Earl of Warwick, he mentioned the ghosts said to haunt the castle in his 1917 book, Memories of 60 Years. He claimed that there was a woman riding a white horse seen galloping through the staterooms at midnight, and that there was a ghost of a dun cow that appeared in the courtyard after she was killed by Guy of Warwick. The story there was that there was this cow that was a huge, gentle animal who let locals milk her as long as they only took one pail. One day, a woman who was irked that she only had small pails and often saw her neighbours carting off huge, great big buckets of milk, she milked the cow and completely milked her dry because she was milking into a sieve, and so all of the cow's milk went to waste. This angered the cow, and she basically turned into a rampaging beast as big as a church with glowing red eyes, until Guy of Warwick tracked her down and defeated her. None of this happened at Warwick Castle specifically, but for some reason the cow is now haunting the courtyard, and the narwhal tusk that's on display in the armoury corridor was said to be one of her ribs. Francis went on to say in his book that there was also a ghost of a grey lady, and that Daisy had seen her multiple times, and she was described as being an old woman dressed in grey who wanders through the corridors and is thought to be responsible for doors opening and closing on their own. And it was also from this time, the early 20th century, where we've got stories about Guy of Warwick himself haunting the castle, which is a very interesting story. Because we've covered Guy's Cliff House before, and if you've watched that one, then you'll know that Guy of Warwick died in a cave on that property, and that his wife Felice is said to haunt the area around there. But the stories from Warwick Castle say that Guy of Warwick now walks from one end of the castle to the other, and that he isn't actually seen, but his footsteps are so loud and echoey that they'll wake you up when they go past. They're just so unnaturally loud. And it's just so interesting when stories connect and intertwine like that, isn't it? Little connections between other places that I've covered. I just love it. But the point I'm trying to get at, in a bit of a roundabout way, is that the ghost stories definitely appear to have evolved over time. From what the family who used to live there experienced while they were there, into the stories that entice modern day visitors to come and explore places like the Ghost Tower for themselves. It's just an interesting point to note. Because there's another story, yeah, we're nowhere near done yet, which again doesn't seem to have made an appearance until much later into the 20th century. This story that's set in the 1200s said that there was an old woman who lived in a cottage below the castle walls. Her name was Moll Bloxon, and as she grew too old to serve the household anymore, the Earl pretty generously let Moll have any leftover milk from the castle kitchens each day so that she could sell it on, maybe make some butter, earn some coin, make a living, all good, right? But as all stories of mine go, things went sideways and Moll started getting greedy. Her customers started complaining to the Earl, saying she was shortchanging them. So he investigated and, yet, found that Moll had been doling out short measures and pocketing the extra profit. The Earl was obviously outraged that she'd been betraying his generosity and ordered that she be publicly tortured by the castle jailer as punishment. But her torture had gone too far, and with her last breath, Moll cursed the town, vowing to come back and seek vengeance. Other versions of the story say that the Earl just banished Moll, kicked her out of the cottage and forced her to leave. But either way, something allegedly unnatural happened. A huge dog with black fur and glowing red eyes appeared and went on a rampage around the castle grounds that night. This dog returned night after night, causing chaos, and apparently targeted the people who had complained about Moll's short measures, killing them one by one. One version of the story says that a servant lured this dog to the River Avon and drowned it, but another version says that the Earl enlisted the help of a group of clergymen to recite prayers to banish the dog, who they figured must be the embodiment of Moll's curse. The priest had chased the dog up Caesar's Tower, where it had no choice but to jump 40 feet into the River Avon below and ended up drowning anyway. Either way, the death of the black dog broke the curse, and now it's said that the ghost of this dog still roams the grounds to this day. But I couldn't find a single witness account of someone claiming to see this phantom black dog, so if you have, or you know anyone who has, please do let me know. But if you're like me and that story just gets your skeptical spidey senses a tingling, and that it just seems like one of those good old ghost stories, then there are still some other potentially paranormal reports attached to the castle that you can chew on. Starting off with the dungeons, of course, because these would have been such a dark place in the castle, both literally and energetically. Over the centuries, countless people have been imprisoned here, tortured here, even thrown down and forgotten about, as the dungeons had its own oubliette, which is a particularly brutal punishment where you're lowered down into what is effectively a hole in the ground. You can't move, you can't sit down, you can't do anything other than tilt your head up to look at the grate, which is way above your head and you have no hope of reaching. You'll either be left here to starve or thrown down a bit of bread every now and then if they need you alive for something, but you can just imagine the energy down here. Not a nice place to be. So it's perhaps unsurprising that the darkest entity said to haunt the castle is down here. Some people believe that an elemental lurks down here, which is a non-human entity and is said to be utterly evil in this case. Others believe that this evil presence is that of an old jailer who enjoyed his job of torturing prisoners a little too much. His figure has actually been seen standing behind a metal gate, glaring at passers-by and yelling if you get too close to him. Visitors have heard guttural, animalistic growls down here, as well as hissing and sadistic laughing right next to their ear, only when they turn, there's no one there. Others have heard pleas for help, presumably from prisoners long ago, and even high-pitched screams coming from the oubliettes. And the way you get down into the dungeon is down a stone staircase, but some people have actually felt hands on their back, almost like someone they can't see is pushing them down the stairs. Others have allegedly noticed red marks and scratches on their wrists, strangely enough where restraints would have been sat on the prisoners kept down there. And for obvious reasons, the dungeon is kind of the place where you walk in and instantly feel someone or something is watching you, and not in a friendly way. But the paranormal activity at Warwick Castle isn't just confined to these places. There is apparently a little 5-year-old girl with blonde hair haunting the castle chapel. She mostly appears to women and seems like she quite likes hanging around this area. She seems perfectly content here. I guess if you had to choose between dungeons or a chapel to haunt for eternity, it's gonna be a pretty easy choice. The Kingmaker exhibition set up to tell the story of Richard Neville, that's somewhat less peaceful. Visitors have apparently reported strange dark shadows here and unexplained crashes, which aren't any of the canned sound effects that you've got playing or anything like that. Little things like coins have been thrown at people in this area too, with absolutely no explanation. The Queen Anne bedchamber, which is actually home to the deathbed of Queen Anne herself, that's said to have some strange things happen. Apparently way back in the 1600s, when the room would have just been known as the State Bedchamber, it would have housed parliamentary soldiers stationed here during the Civil War, who probably wouldn't have been a big fan of all the pomp and frills that came with staying in a place like this. And so now, allegedly, a foreboding Roundhead soldier has been picked up in this area. But one story that did make me laugh when I saw it was that the ladies' loos at Warwick Castle are also said to be haunted. I don't know what it is about women's toilets that makes them such a hotspot, but Alton Towers, the Four Crosses, the Ostrich Inn, all have haunted ladies' toilets. But at the castle though, a woman has been seen walking into one of these cubicles, and after a suspicious amount of time has passed and she hasn't come back out, someone will go and check on her only to find that there is no one in there. But believe it or not, that's still not the most unusual haunting. So Warwick Castle is one of these tourist attractions where people coming on holiday to the UK, they'll go out on excursions to. So it's not unusual to see great big busloads of tourists from any particular country rock up for a day at the castle. And there's a story of a ghostly Japanese tourist who only appears to other Japanese tourists visiting Warwick Castle. But that's all the information I have on him. It's interesting, as far as I know, there have been no Japanese tourists pass away at the castle. There was a visitor who tragically died after falling into the dry moat back in 2007, but he was from Solihull, not Japan. So if you're visiting from Japan, look out for a friendly figure who may appear to give you a warm welcome. And there have been so many other reports of activity at the castle too, everything from physical sensations of being pushed or grabbed, drastic temperature changes even though there are no drafts, light anomalies seen, and sometimes just the overwhelming, uneasy feeling like something you can't see is watching you from the shadows. And so it seems like the spirits that call Warwick Castle home have been making themselves known for over 100 years, in one way or another. And sure, the stories, the witnesses, and even the names might change, and let's be honest, sometimes the reasons for telling these stories can be quite questionable. But one thing is definitely for sure, the centuries of turbulent history at Warwick Castle have seemingly left behind more than a few ghostly echoes. If you believe the stories, that is. Wow, this one was a challenge to put together. I'm not out here making my life any easier knowing I've got 16 videos to put out in October in this entirely self-inflicted schedule that I've put on myself, so absolutely do not feel sorry for me in any way. The history of Warwick Castle truly was something else. There was so much to it. And then unpicking the ghost stories and who said what and when, very interesting, but worth it. I absolutely do believe that the castle is haunted. It's got centuries of history, sieges, imprisonment, family dramas, life, death, and everything in between. That's gotta leave a mark. Having haunted dungeons with all of that suffering and torment, that just seems to be a given at this point, right? But then, on the other hand, I do believe that some of these stories were made up. Fulk Greville, obviously his murder did actually happen, but his ghost story, along with Mole Bloxham and the Black Dog, I feel like, especially considering the time that these stories came to light, and looking at the wider context of the Greville family potentially being under financial strain with trying to take care of such a big property like this, seems to make sense. I've been to the castle a few times myself as well, and I've had an absolutely terrifying experience when I was younger. If my family are watching right now, you already know what I'm about to say. So we'd gone through the entire castle, all great, had a great time, and I'd seen a sign for the castle dungeons, which was weird. I thought we'd already gone into the castle dungeon already, but even way back then, I couldn't have been older than, like, what, 10? I was a weird kid, and if there was a chance that I could learn more about dark history, maybe some torture devices, some more waxwork models, I was all up for it. So me and my mom, we queued up for the castle dungeons attraction. Yep, little little 10-year-old me did not know that this particular castle dungeons was actually the live action scare attraction thing that they'd got set up. The man coming behind me and screaming into my ear and making me jump in the first room was my first clue that I was not going to be okay. Somehow my mom got me through. I was traumatized. She marched me through. I'm in an absolute state, and as we're finally about to get back into the cold light of day, one of the actors said something like, "Oh, you'll be next." And my mom, she's a saint. She carried on marching this distraught kid towards the exit and just belts out, "Oh no, she won't be." So that was my first experience of a scare attraction and my totally not paranormal story from Warwick Castle. But anyway, as always, tell me your thoughts. I absolutely love reading all of the comments and seeing what your takeaways from these stories are, paranormal or not. And if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button. And if you fancy more like this and you haven't already, it would be super cool of you to make sure that you're subscribed. I'd love to have you back for another story. Because that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I think the cat's on one. He's just running around in circles. He's doing a lap around the house. So what he'll do is he'll go down into the conservatory if it's open. He'll go up the window, then he'll start yowling, and then he'll like run. You know those when they go sideways and they're like running, like trying to make themselves big. He'll do that into the living room, stop, look around, gallop up the stairs, come into the office, come round, and then go back down. That's his lap of glory that he does.